The world made me a symbol. I never asked for it. Brigitte Bardot never wanted to be famous, but by 22, she was the most photographed woman on earth and trapped in a life she couldn't escape. One film, and God Created Woman, transformed a Parisian teenager into an international obsession. Her hair, her walk, her silhouette, everything about Bardot became a global trend. Politicians argued about her morals. Designers copied her every detail. The world called her a sex symbol. She was everywhere. Yet, privately, she questioned every headline. Bardot didn't set out to be famous. She wasn't groomed for stardom. She openly rejected the labels thrown at her. Feminist icon, sexual revolutionary, cultural threat.
La révolution sexuelle? Mais cette étiquette, elle a été un peu lourde à porter pour vous, non? Vous n'en vouliez pas nécessairement?
La révolution sexuelle, non. Parce que avant moi, c'en est déjà passé des vertes et des pas mûres. Hein. Ils m'ont pas attendu. Le féminisme, c'est pas mon truc. Moi, j'aime bien les mecs.
But the world wasn't listening. Even decades after her last film, the calls haven't stopped. Documentaries still dissect her. Controversies still circle her name. Her image remains profitable, long after she stepped away from the cameras. Today, her name is iconic, but Bardot herself remains a contradiction, the world's ultimate sex symbol, desperate to be forgotten. So how did it happen? How does a young woman's face become a global obsession and a prison? To find the real Brigitte Bardot, you have to start before anyone knew her name. Before the world turned her into BB, Brigitte Bardot was a girl raised in the shadow of discipline and tradition. She grew up in a well-off but strict Parisian home where rules were clear and expectations even clearer. Her mother, determined and cultured, insisted on ballet lessons from the time Bardot could walk. For years, her life was measured in rehearsals and routines, shaped less by dreams of fame than by the demands of perfection. Modeling wasn't part of any plan. It was an accident. At 15, Bardot appeared on the cover of Elle magazine, a moment her family assumed would be a brief curiosity. Instead, it drew the attention of film directors, including Roger Vadim, a young writer with his own ideas about what French cinema could be. Vadim saw in Bardot not just beauty, but something raw, something the screen hadn't shown before. She wasn't trying to play a part. She wasn't a studio creation. At 16, she still felt unsure on set. Years later, she would reflect, "I wasn't meant for all this." But at the time, there was excitement too. The sense of breaking away from something and stepping into something of her own. By 18, Bardot had married Vadim and stepped outside the boundaries of her old life. Their relationship was as much about creative rebellion as romance. Vadim encouraged her to break the rules, to ignore what people expected. And she did. Then came And God Created Woman, the film that didn't just launch Bardot's career but changed cinema. Bardot wasn't interested in playing a character. She brought her own vulnerability and defiance to the role. Actress Jeanne Moreau, who worked with Bardot during those years, put it best.
Such a beautiful body and such a marvelous way of walking. I've never seen anybody walk the way she walks. And you can't even say she walks like a dancer, no. She has this, an inner grace that is incredible.
That untrainable, unpolished quality turned the film into a phenomenon. Her image dominated magazine covers. In Europe, she was celebrated and condemned. In America, she was exoticized, misunderstood, and endlessly copied. People imitated her hair, her walk, her clothes. The press called her the liberation of the female body. Bardot hadn't set out to be a star. She hadn't set out to be a symbol. If anything, she spent those early years running from what she had become. By the late 1950s, Bardot was no longer just an actress. She was a debate, celebrated and censored, idolized and attacked. her every move analyzed. Politicians questioned her influence. Church leaders condemned her films. Designers rushed to keep up with what she wore. Her presence was felt far beyond the screen. And Bardot, for her part, didn't understand it either. "I didn't want to become a myth," she once said. "But I became one all the same." Bardot had become a myth. The world saw her as a symbol. But that symbol came at a price. By the late 1950s, the adoration and criticism that followed her everywhere had turned into a kind of cage. The applause hadn't stopped, but it didn't feel like freedom anymore. Her marriage to Roger Vadim, the man who had helped define her early career, ended in 1957. The breakup was splashed across headlines, another chapter in what the public saw as the ongoing story of Bardot. The cameras didn't look away. If anything, the fascination grew. In 1959, Bardot married actor Jacques Chériot. The press framed it as a fairy tale match, France's most famous woman and the man who would give her stability. But Bardot felt the walls closing in. The marriage wasn't about escape. It was about stepping into another set of expectations she hadn't chosen. Later that year, Bardot discovered she was pregnant. The news was met with celebration. To the public, it was proof that Bardot's life was unfolding like a dream. But privately, she felt crushed by the weight of it. She later wrote about staring at her reflection, watching her body change, and feeling her identity slip away. "I looked at my flat, slender belly like a dear friend upon whom I was about to close a coffin lid. Every magazine wanted the exclusive. Every photograph became part of the myth. Bardot didn't want it. She didn't want to be the symbol they had created, not in her career and not in her private life." When Nicolas was born in early 1960, the headlines were filled with stories of joy. But Bardot felt none of it. The pressures of motherhood, marriage, and fame collided. Chériot wanted a conventional family. Bardot couldn't give him that. She felt isolated, cornered by a life she hadn't chosen. And still, the world saw her not just as a celebrity, but as the face of fashion, cinema, and cultural change. She remained a central figure, photographed, copied, debated. The press followed her every move, not only for scandal, but because the public wasn't ready to let her go. The photographers never left. The directors kept calling. The world expected Bardot to keep playing the part it had written for her. But inside, she was coming undone. That September, Bardot attempted suicide. She overdosed on sleeping pills at her home in Paris. A neighbor found her in time. The press called it a scandal, a cry for help, another dramatic chapter in Bardot's life for the public to consume. The headlines sold the story. The deeper truth, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the loss, was ignored. There was no pause, no space for recovery. The work continued. Contracts were active. Films had to be made. The cameras kept rolling. Bardot kept showing up. But the passion was gone. By the early 1960s, Bardot's life no longer felt like her own. She kept acting, but it felt mechanical. Photographers waited outside her home. Strangers lingered near her gates. The press kept writing. Every relationship, every argument, every fleeting moment became public property.
That a glamour girl, it's a very difficult life.
Oh yes,
you see?
it's a very difficult life.
Now,
Difficult for me.
Even at the height of her success, Bardot was already speaking about the emotional cost. In a light but telling moment on American television, she admitted she planned to retire after just 10 years of acting.
Oh, no, it's very easy for me.
How?
Because it's difficult for me to work.
But the world wasn't done with her yet. Bardot had given everything the public wanted, and it still wasn't enough. The next years would test how much more she could bear. Through the 1960s, Bardot kept working. On screen, she remained a force. Directors kept calling, producers kept offering scripts. But inside, something had shifted. The thrill that had once come with acting was gone. Bardot no longer chose roles because they excited her. She accepted them because contracts demanded it, because the world still expected her to perform. The spotlight that had once felt electric now felt suffocating. Every film, every appearance, every choice became part of the public conversation. Her face sold magazines. Her style filled store windows. Her life filled column inches. Bardot was still a star, but the cost was growing heavier with each passing year. Her personal life offered no refuge. After the collapse of her marriage to Jacques Charrier, Bardot searched for something steady, and in 1966, she married German businessman Günther Sachs. The wedding was a spectacle. The photographs ran in papers around the world. But behind the glamour, Bardot felt what she had felt before. That the life people imagined for her and the life she was living were two very different things. The marriage, like the ones before it, was short-lived. Even Saint-Tropez, the quiet fishing village where Bardot had hoped to find peace, turned against her. When she first bought her villa at La Madrague, it was meant as a sanctuary. But her presence transformed the town. Crowds followed her there, turning the village into a destination. The refuge became another stage, another place where Bardot was watched, photographed, discussed. By the second half of the decade, Bardot had begun turning down roles. The excitement of cinema, the joy of creation, it had disappeared. The directors still called, the scripts still came, but Bardot was no longer interested. And yet, the public's fascination didn't fade. Photographers still camped outside her home. Strangers still hovered beyond her gates. Her image was still debated in Parliament, condemned from the pulpit, copied in shop windows. But Bardot herself was done. By the end of the 1960s, she had stopped chasing anything. The woman who had once defined an era of cinema, who had once captivated the world, was preparing to walk away, not with a dramatic farewell, but with quiet resolve. The world wasn't finished with Bardot, but Bardot was finished with the world it had built around her. And by the early 1970s, Bardot was no longer trying to manage the spotlight. She wanted out. In 1973, at the age of 39, she announced her retirement from acting. There was no farewell tour, no dramatic final role. Bardot simply stepped away. She had spent more than 2 decades being watched, judged, and photographed, and now she wanted to live on her own terms. The scripts didn't stop. Directors still hoped to convince her back to the screen, but Bardot had made up her mind. Acting had given her fame, but it hadn't given her peace. She didn't miss it. From her home at La Madrague in Saint-Tropez, Bardot tried to build a quieter existence. But the world wouldn't entirely let her go. Tourists kept coming, drawn by the legend she had become. Reporters still speculated about a comeback. Bardot ignored it all. The life she wanted now had nothing to do with cinema. What did matter to Bardot was speaking up for causes she believed in. In the 1970s France, abortion rights were a deeply divisive issue. Bardot shocked the country when she publicly supported legal abortion, lending her voice to the growing movement that would eventually help change the law. Me, abortion, I'm for it. I think a woman has the right to choose when to bring a child into the world. No one has the right to impose a child on her. The backlash was immediate. Religious groups condemned her. Politicians criticized her. But Bardot didn't back down. After years of being treated as an object of fantasy, she was finally using her voice for something that mattered to her. At the same time, Bardot's lifelong concern for animals began to define her public image far more than any film ever had. Even during her acting years, she had rescued strays from sets and streets. Now, freed from the demands of fame, she focused her energy on animal welfare. She spoke out against cruel hunting practices, condemned the use of animal fur, and began lobbying for stronger protections. Bardot didn't just lend her name to campaigns. She put her resources behind them. For Bardot, this wasn't about image. It was about building a new purpose. Her withdrawal from film wasn't a pause or a break. It was permanent. Bardot didn't want to look back. What she wanted was to move forward. And for the first time in her life, that meant on her own terms. By the 1980s, Bardot's commitment to animal welfare had become more than a passion. It was her mission. In 1986, she founded the Brigitte Bardot Foundation for the Welfare and Protection of Animals. The funding came from Bardot herself. She sold her jewelry, designer clothes, and memorabilia from her film career, raising millions of francs to launch the organization. Unlike many celebrities who lend their names to causes, Bardot was involved directly. She protested outside government buildings. She wrote letters to politicians. She delivered speeches in courtrooms. She traveled to lobby for legal protections and to challenge practices like seal hunting, fur farming, and the use of animals in cosmetics testing. Her villa in Saint-Tropez became as much a shelter as a home. Reporters described it as filled with stray dogs and cats, a refuge for creatures Bardot had taken in over the years. The woman who had once been seen as the ultimate screen siren was now better known for her work defending animals. But as Bardot's activism became more visible, so did her personal views. And they weren't always received the same way. In the 1990s, she began publishing books and letters that criticized immigration policies, Islam, and what she saw as threats to French identity. The comments sparked outrage. In 1996, Bardot was convicted for inciting racial hatred after writing an opinion piece denouncing ritual animal slaughter during religious holidays and linking it to what she described as attacks on French culture. The courts fined her, but Bardot didn't apologize. The pattern repeated in the years that followed. More writings, more convictions, more fines. By 2008, she had been convicted 5 times under France's hate speech laws. I belong to no party. I am militant for no one. All of my causes, including the most radical, are motivated by the defense of animals. To her supporters, Bardot was still seen as fiercely independent, someone who spoke her mind, rejected political correctness, and refused to be silenced. To her critics, she had become a figure of intolerance, her legacy tangled in views that felt out of place in modern France. The media's portrayal of Bardot shifted. Once the face of liberation, she was now frequently described in headlines as controversial or divisive. Her refusal to soften or explain her positions only deepened the divide. When producers approached her for documentaries or retrospective projects, Bardot almost always declined. She rejected dramatizations of her life, refused to consult on scripts, and rarely gave interviews. No, never. I have a real life now. I don't belong to anyone. I am myself. Despite her retreat from public life, Bardot's presence has remained impossible to ignore. Statues and tributes to her stand in parts of France, especially in Saint-Tropez, where she once redefined the image of the French Riviera. At the same time, activists have launched petitions calling for their removal, arguing that Bardot's views should disqualify her from public honor. The debate reflects a larger tension in French society, between memory and modern values, between nostalgia for icons and accountability for their words. In pop culture, Bardot's image still echoes, on fashion runways, in art, in the faces of younger stars styled in her likeness. But Bardot herself stays apart, focused on her foundation, her animals, and a small circle of trusted allies. Few figures in French culture are as complex, as debated, or as impossible to ignore. Bardot may have left the spotlight, but the world still can't stop watching.